Hi, everybody. I'm going to try to keep this as brief as possible, but I just want to give you a few notes on the idea of federalism. This is chapter 4 in your textbook. I highly recommend reading this chapter as well. All right, so federalism, the system of federalism, the idea is that the government, the federal government and the state governments are sharing power. So they both do specific things. We've gone over this earlier in the year. The first thing I want you guys to think about is, why did we do this? Well, what's important to understand is that when we were founded as a country, it was the 1700s. The only way you could travel is by horseback. So to have a national government, which at the time, in either New York or Philadelphia, having to deal with things all the way down in Georgia seemed crazy. As the country got bigger, it did become even more apparent with places like California that it would be very hard to govern the whole country based off how far apart everything is. Over time, with globalization and the ability to travel, it has become more manageable, but at the same time, should we really have a capital on the East Coast in Washington, D.C., taking care of issues all the way in Hawaii? Okay, that was the idea. All right, you guys will watch these videos separately. They're on Canvas. All right, so just want to go over a couple things from the Constitution, which is where the idea of federalism comes from. First of all, an expressed power. Guys, these are, or also known as delegated powers, these are super straightforward. As long as you know what the word expressed means and think about its connection to the Constitution, you'll understand this. It just means that it is directly written in the Constitution. Okay, it says the powers explicitly granted to Congress. Explicitly granted just means that it's written down and it says that, the federal government can do that. All right, we're going to skip over this. All right, the necessary and proper clause. This is part of the Constitution in Article 1, Section 8. Okay, it's called the elastic clause. The reason why it's called elastic is I want you to think about a rubber band, right? It stretches, it's flexible, and it has something called the necessary and proper clause. Basically, it's just saying that the government has the power to create, and Congress in particular has the power to create laws that are necessary and proper, okay, for being able to run a government. So basically, they have to do what they need to do, okay? It's called the elastic clause. Implied powers. These are powers that are not directly written in the Constitution, but you can assume they would be true. So, for example, Congress says they have to collect income tax, okay, but it doesn't say how to collect it or what means they have to go by doing it. But they created the IRS, which would be part of like an implied power. Like, this is something that, even though it doesn't directly say they can create an agency to go around and collect money, it's kind of implied that they need something like that to do that. So anything that's logical, that's common sense, even though common sense seems not to be so common anymore, that the government would do, they can do. All right, we're going to kind of move away from that. All right, inherent powers. An inherent power that just means that the federal government is going to inherit it because it makes sense. Just like inheritance, from your grandparents or from your parents or something. It's something that they got. They didn't ask for it, but it just kind of makes sense. It wouldn't make sense for the state of Ohio to be declaring wars on other countries, or for the District of Columbia to be doing it, for Maryland or Virginia. It does make sense for the federal government to be the ones making those decisions, declaring war, raising an army, making treaties with other countries. So mostly you could think of an inherent power as things that have to deal with foreign policy, but just to keep this thing straightforward, it's something that they inherited, something that makes sense that they have. All right, state powers. Okay, the Constitution does not have a lot to say about state powers, but what you can kind of take from this is anything that's not covered by the government is to be controlled by the state. So basically, if the federal government doesn't cover it, it's up for the states. And where this can come from mostly is from the 10th Amendment. Okay, the 10th Amendment says, things that are not written in this Constitution are reserved to the states. And that's why we have some differences depending on whether you live in Maryland or Virginia or DC. Think about differences in the driver's test. That's something that affects all of you guys. Or speed limits, or the hot topic one here that I always like to mention with students because it makes them pay attention more. Marijuana laws are different. So there's differences everywhere with different states, and there are normally just slight differences. Okay, these are known as reserved powers because they are reserved for the states. And the reason why they do it this way is because the idea is that every state is different. They're geographically different. They have different populations. They have different economies. And because of that, it makes more sense for a government that can focus on those specific issues to reserve those powers or to make those decisions. All right, so like I said before, okay, this is a great little example of, which states still do a parallel parking test. You guys, both DC and or in Maryland and Virginia, both have it. DC does not, though. All right, West Coast does. I had to do it in Ohio, but look at all these other places that don't have it. I think they really need to be doing that, especially Kentucky. All right, some other things, speed limits. These are things that I talked about before. Some things that are shared by both the federal government and the state governments. They can both collect taxes, build roads, things like this. You guys can kind of read through this. I'm not going to just read them all to you. But as you could see, things that you could probably come up with on your own that that both can do. All right, the supremacy clause. This, guys, there's a lot of reading here. Just make sure you write down what this last bullet point says in bold. The supremacy clause basically states that the federal government has power over the state government. So if there's two laws that contradict each other, the federal government saying one thing and the state saying the other, the federal government is correct. Okay, some things that states can't do. All right, they can't make their own money. You have to use U.S. dollars. You cannot use Maryland dollars, right? Maryland can't make its own money, right? You have to use the federal government's money. And also they can't tax imports and exports from other states. It's just, listen, the rest of the world deserves Old Bay too. You can't tax it just because it's from Maryland. All right, and then obviously things like having their own armies, engaging in wars with other states or nations, it all kind of makes sense. It's asking why, because we want to have some uniformity in our society, and by having the federal government regulate certain things like our currency, like our ability to go to war, it makes everything run more smoothly. Okay, the full faith and credit clause. This means that basically states trust other states if they're in they're in America, right? My Virginia driver's license means that I can drive in DC. It means that I can drive in Maryland because we said, guess what, guys? We trust each other. We know that Maryland's test is good in Virginia, and Maryland knows Virginia's test is good there. That's kind of the idea behind it. Okay, so we trust the different licenses that are given out and other things, that would be a little bit different state to state. All right, that's a slow show, guys. Feel free to email me with any questions, and take a look out for readings and videos that you'll have to do on Canvas. Thank you guys very much.